Hello and welcome everyone to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Black Craftspeople, Objects, and the Southern Landscape, we are joined by Tiffany Moman, founder and co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. Thanks so much for being with us today, Tiffany.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Amy and Jessica, for inviting me today. And a big thank you to everyone working behind the scenes to make this talk happen. And happy Juneteenth, everyone. So I titled today's talk, Art Speaks, Black Craftspeople, Objects, and the Southern Landscape. And today I'll give you a brief introduction to the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, but I'd also like to take some time to discuss objects and the Southern landscape. And so first, I'd like to begin with a story. In doing this research of finding lesser known Black craftspeople and documenting their lives and experiences, I often turn to newspapers. In fact, newspapers are the primary source that we use at the BCDA. And as I was preparing for today's talk and searching for Missouri stories, I found this obituary in the Sedalia Democrat of Sedalia, Missouri, published on May 6, 1929. And the obituary reads, Max Smith, age 70, Negro blacksmith of this city who has operated a shop here for about 50 years, died at General Hospital number 2 early Sunday morning. The obituary goes on to note that he will be buried at Georgetown. I was immediately drawn to this obituary because of the line, quote, Max Scott, who has operated a shop here for about 50 years, meaning that Mr. Scott opened his shop in 1879 at the age of 20. And in examining what I could determine from the article, I immediately wondered, what might Mr. Scott have made in his blacksmith shop for 50 years? 50 years is a very long time. What objects did he create? Did he create andirons? Did he create decorative objects? Did he create horseshoes, iron fences, or gates? Did he create light fixtures, sculptures, tools, and hardware? How did the objects that Mr. Scott create impact life in Sedalia? And how did those objects impact the landscape? How did Mr. Scott himself, just by his presence alone, significantly change life in Sedalia? Today, Sedalia is a town of about 20,000 people. It is located on Highway 50, about a bit more than halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City. It is the county seat of Pettis County, and Max Scott called this area home for the majority of his life. For example, he lived in a home on West Morgan Street. His customers might have come from locations depicted on this map to acquire his goods. And a quick search into Mr. Scott's life revealed even more. An article in the October 4th, 1906 edition of the Sedalia Democrat newspaper revealed that Mr. Scott was a charter member of the Negro Republican Club. In fact, he was even voted president. Other articles revealed that he was active in local politics and that he often did blacksmith work for the city of Sedalia. Receipts indicate that he worked as a blacksmith on what was known as the 12-mile road district in the area. And take, for example, this article pictured on screen, included in the September 30th, 1905 edition of the Sedalia Conservator newspaper, describing Mr. Scott's shop on West Jefferson Street. A quick look through Sanborn fire insurance maps gives us an idea of what West Jefferson Street looked like in 1898, just 3 years after Mr. Scott opened his blacksmith shop. Today, West Jefferson Street in Sedalia is missing the homes and buildings pictured on the 1908 map. Most of the lots are vacant and overgrown. But once upon a time, You could walk down this street and hear the crackling fire, the sounds of the blacksmith's bellows fanning the fire, and even the sound of hammering coming from Mr. Scott's blacksmith shop. Stories such as Mr. Scott's form the foundation of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a digital humanities site dedicated to documenting the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from their arrival through 1900. The website is currently home to records connected to the lives of 960 Black craftspeople, both men and women, both free and enslaved, involved in 45 total trades, from wheelwrights and tanners to cabinet makers and goldsmiths, who lived and labored in the 18th century South Carolina Lowcountry and 19th century Tennessee. We launched the beta or in testing version of the website on August 31st, 2020. We launched phase 2 of the website, including our Tennessee collection, in March 2021. Working together as a team, we consulted with digital humanists, GIS developers, archivists, and website designers to complete what you see here. The project has 2 main components that are live right now, and the first component is the archive. The archives page will bring you here, where you have the option to browse by collection organized by trade, use the search engine to find Black craftspeople by keyword, or even to contribute your own research or knowledge on Black craftspeople fully attributed to you. The second component is the map placing craftspeople on the landscape of the South Carolina Lowcountry and the state of Tennessee. A click over to the maps page will bring you here, where you have the ability to search the data in a variety of ways. So that was a very, very brief overview of the archive and map, and now I would like to talk about the why. Why did we even need a digital humanities project such as this one? And really, I wanted to use a resource that moved beyond traditional archival collections of craftspeople and just the endless collection and cataloging of names. I wanted to better visualize the data. I wanted to ask more questions, interpret the data in new ways, and I wanted to see these Black craftspeople. And I found that the best way for me to see them was through place and landscape. I wanted to facilitate discussions on movement, hence the creation of the map, and I found that there was just so much more to the story that the public was not getting for a variety of reasons. And this is the way that we approach doing this work. We tell stories through these 3 avenues. First, we begin by examining sources, and these can be anything from newspaper articles to census records to wills and estate records. We comb through them looking for details and names, and then we record all of that info. We started this project using advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated craftspeople, and there is so much in those advertisements that raises so many questions. For example, advertisements provide us with a wealth of information on practiced trades, physical descriptions, literacy, language, why they self-emancipated, possible destinations, and more. Since that time, we have incorporated advertisements selling enslaved Black craftspeople and United States Census records. And next, we turn to objects. And the purpose here is to take existing objects and research them to find out more about their creator and their creation. When we examine objects, we step away from the art history connoisseurship approach and we center the craftsperson. We start by asking simply, who made the object? And then we move to questions such as what skill or knowledge did the creation of the object require? What were the craftsperson's experiences? And how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And our third avenue is place. And when I say place, I am thinking beyond just latitude and longitude points. I am thinking about the presence of people. I am thinking about the effect of people on place and the effect of place on people. And of course, these 3 avenues all rest upon understanding the context of Black life in this country. So I want to talk quickly about how we approach this work, and I want to start with these 2 quotes. The first is an advertisement seeking the return of a self emancipated individual. And the quote that stands out to me in this advertisement reads, "He is so ingenious a fellow that he can turn his hand to anything." So when I first saw this advertisement and read the description here of Peter Deadfoot, a Black craftsperson, I could not help but to think of all of the objects and landscapes that Mr. Deadfoot might have touched. And like I mentioned, I am so drawn to that last line that he is so ingenious a fellow that he can turn his hand to anything. And I'm following this advertisement with a quote from Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and it reads, quote, "One only needs to go down south and examine hundreds of old Southern mansions and splendid old church edifices, still intact, to be convinced of the fact of the cleverness of the Negro artisan, who constructed 9/10 of them, and many of them still provoke the admiration of all who see them, and are not to be despised by the men of our day." And Du Bois's summation here is that Black craftspeople contributed to 9/10 of the built environment in the South. And so, taken together, these two quotes speak directly to how I think about objects and landscapes, and they also speak directly to the work that we do at the BCDA. And in thinking about place and landscapes and the effect that Black craftspeople had on the landscape and the effect that the landscape had on them, I want to turn your attention to another source. One of the things that I'm always interested in when we look at new areas is finding the presence of some of the earliest Black craftspeople in those areas. And so, when researching Missouri, I, of course, came across the story of Philippe Francois Renaud, a French merchant who traveled up the Mississippi River in 1720 and stopped in what is now known as Missouri and brought along with him 500 enslaved individuals from the French colony of Saint Domingue, the island that is currently home to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And those 500 enslaved individuals labored in lead mines. And while researching Renaud and lead mining, I stumbled across this source titled "Free Negroes Licensed in St. Louis, Missouri in 1835." And so, a bit of backstory here. On March 14th, 1835, the General Assembly of the state of Missouri passed an act concerning free Negroes and mulattoes. And that act stated that all free persons of color had to apply for a freedom license. And so, this source, which you can find at the St. Louis County Library, includes lists of free African Americans along with their ages, physical descriptions, and occupations. And according to historian Ebony Jenkins, the list contains 63 occupations, including trades such as blacksmiths, whitewashers, plasterers, carpenters, and seamstresses. From December 1835 to May 1863, Jenkins found that there were 50 seamstresses, 22 whitewashers, 9 carpenters, 7 clothes makers, 5 blacksmiths, 5 coopers, 5 wood sawyers, 2 shoemakers, 2 painters, 2 brickmakers, 1 miner, 1 stonemason, 1 turner, and 1 saddler, amongst the other trades. And some of those people's names I've listed here on screen. Included was Jane Applebay, a seamstress, Aurora and Clarice Abuchan, both seamstresses, Felicity Benite, a seamstress, Angeline Camp, a seamstress, Jefferson Camp, a carpenter, Catherine Creever, a seamstress, John Barry Meacham, a cooper, and William Robinson, a house painter. And you can find this source, like I mentioned, at the St. Louis County Library. And a little research on some of these free Black craftspeople lets us explore their worlds just a bit more. On screen near the top is a copy of the 1840 U.S. Census, and I've highlighted there Jane Applebay's name, and I've also highlighted the header there of free colored persons. And below that is the U.S. Census record entry for Jefferson Camp and his wife Angeline, and you can see there that it lists him as a carpenter. So now, how do we connect the story of objects and sources to the landscape and Black craftspeople? And I want you for just a second to take a look at this image and think about what exactly you are looking at here. And so what you're looking at here is this, a pottery waste pile connected to African American potter David Drake. This site is on property privately owned by the state of South Carolina. But in this wilderness are hundreds of broken pots, jugs, bowls, you name it, crafted by Black craftswomen and men. And this waster pile is home to all of the pottery that just wasn't quite right for sale. Maybe it didn't get fired right correctly in the kiln, maybe it cracked. But this site was also home to famed Black potter David Drake from 1846 to 1849. And the St. Louis Art Museum is home to one of David Drake's pots, which is pictured here on screen. And you can also see a close-up image there of Dave's signature. I have to admit that this waster pile is among one of the most amazing places that I have ever been to. And when I look at the pots of the waster pile and think about how large these operations were and the manpower behind these operations, and then when I combine that with what we know about David Drake, knowing that several enslavers in the area claimed ownership of his body and labor, what emerges for me are thoughts about community and the effects of David Drake's presence on different communities and the effects of those different enslaved potter communities on him. And it suddenly sheds new light on his work and the poetry that he wrote into the sides of these pots. But David Drake's work also raises more questions. And I'm specifically thinking about who worked alongside him, what are their names, and who are they? Recent research by scholar Dr. Corbett Toussaint has shed light on over 200 African American potters who lived and labored in the Edgefield district of South Carolina near David Drake. And I encourage you to read her work and read the stories of the people that she's found so far. What Dr. Toussaint's work reveals is just the depths of how much information on Black craftspeople is waiting to be discovered and shared. And you can find her article along with an appendix of Black craftspeople's names at mesdajournal.org. And when we at the BCDA examine objects such as the David Drake pot in the collections of the St. Louis Art Museum, these are the types of questions that we ask. As I've mentioned, this project is all about centering Black craftspeople. So when we examine objects, we ask ourselves some of the questions pictured here on screen. We start out, of course, by asking who made the object, but we then continue with a series of questions to flesh out the craftsperson's life. When we examine objects, I mentioned that we step away from the traditional art history way of doing things. And one of my favorite questions here is, how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And here I am specifically thinking of what bits of craft knowledge were passed from craftsperson to craftsperson. What was learned on the job that they might have passed down? And we take the answers to those questions and we use those answers to build the archive. We turn to those primary and secondary sources and use as much information as they have to aid us in creating archival entries for each of the Black craftspeople that we find. On screen are the categories of information that we look for. And when we use advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated individuals, we just fill in the blanks. On screen, we have an advertisement from the South Carolina Gazette dated February 5th, 1778, seeking the return of Joe and enslaved goldsmiths. And the information collected lets us figure out what we can determine about Joe's story and also provides us with more avenues for research. And one thing that I always do, like I mentioned, is to read newspapers. I literally will sit down behind my computer screen and read them page by page. And what I'm looking for and what I want to read them to find is to discover how people in this particular instance people in Missouri are writing about Black craftspeople at the time. And of course, this approach varies by region. And next, I turn to the census, and I read the census much like I read newspapers, line by line. And on screen is the 1870 census for Ward 10 in St. Louis. And I was able to find 3 carpenters, and I've pulled their names out on screen here for you. First is Anthony Williams, age 50, a carpenter living in a home valued at $4,000. In the home with Anthony are John Burney, age 30, and also a carpenter, and John Williams, age 23, and also a carpenter. And Anthony's home was located at 1014 North 7th Street. A quick Google search for North 7th Street showed me what is now known as North 7th Street in downtown St. Louis. Over time, street names change. Streets get renumbered, so more research is needed to confirm a specific location for Anthony Williams's home. I also discovered that Mr. Williams died January 11th, 1897, and apparently his body was given to the anatomical board. So again, more research is needed because I'd love to find out more circumstances behind this. But Mr. Williams' story provides you with a good example of how we do this primary source research and how we layer the documents to tell us a more complete story. And here are a few more stories pulled straight from the US Census. On screen is an 1870 census entry for Matt Dowell, a brick molder living in Ward 3 in St. Louis. And we also have Adam Wilden, a brick molder, and Thomas Anderson, a fireman in a brickyard. And again, all of these craftspeople are living in the same area. And so now I'm wondering just how close that brickyard is to where they live. A quick review of an 1867 city directory revealed that at the time there were about 30 brickyards in St. Louis. And when we examine landscapes, we do exactly what we discussed earlier in the example of Max Scott. We research those places, and when we can, we actually go to those places. I was very excited to begin traveling again just this spring. And what you're looking at here is the rear of Blount Mansion in Knoxville, Tennessee. Last April, my colleague Victoria and I visited Blount Mansion looking for connections to Black craftspeople. We'd found this advertisement pictured here on screen, and we knew that there had been enslaved people at this particular site. When we visited, we learned even more. In fact, the curator shared with us that there had been a nailery at this site that was fully staffed by enslaved blacksmiths. But for us at the BCDA, the story becomes even larger than that. I want you to see exactly where Blount Mansion is. It is that little blue dot in that yellow square on screen. It was constructed in 1792, and the city of Knoxville grew around it. And today it rests in a little area of downtown Knoxville across the street from a busy parking garage. But this site is important because hundreds of people drive past it or walk past it every day without really thinking about what they're seeing. When people tell me that they can't find Black craftspeople, my next question is always, well, what do you mean? And I ask that because Black craftspeople were everywhere. You cannot walk through cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, that retain a lot of their historic building fabric and not pass a site that is connected to or associated with a Black craftsperson. And this is what Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois was sharing in his quote that I mentioned earlier. And this is something that I always stress to people. We may not have all of the objects associated with Black makers. We may not be able to definitively attribute all of the objects in museum collections that curators think are made by Black craftspeople to a specific person. But what we can attribute to them is their presence on the landscape, because the one thing that has never gone away is the land. And so as we consider to think about how to use the landscape to tell stories of Black craftspeople, we know that we need to expand to more areas. And on screen are the areas in which we have ongoing research. And just this month, we ventured outside of the South to New York, where we have two interns fully engaged in conducting New York research for us. I actually just met with them yesterday, and I am constantly amazed by the stories that they've been able to uncover about Black craftsmanship in New York. And here's a sneak peek at some of the work coming out of Jamaica. When we at the BCDA began to think about what was next, I suggested that we head to the Caribbean. And what makes the hunt for craftspeople in Jamaica so interesting is that most of the advertisements seeking the return of self emancipated craftspeople list where the self emancipated person was from. So, for example, the advertisement on screen there in the yellow box on the far right for Billy mentions that he is from the Coromantee country. The term Coromantee was an English word for people who were from present day Ghana on the coast of West Africa. And so when we're working on map visualizations for Jamaica, and so here's a sneak peek of what we're thinking about when we're doing this work. We want to connect what you see is the tiny island of Jamaica there at the end of the yellow arrow to Ghana, which we have highlighted there, and then also connecting it to the primary source advertisement that mentions the phrase Coromantee country. And so we're working on ways to figure out how to best do this, how to tell the story in the best way that we possibly can, and how to best show connections to Ghana and other West African countries so that people can understand this type of forced migration. We're also thinking about ways here to layer space, time, and history without leaving out the humanity in these stories. And so, in looking at this map, you might also be wondering about the red line and arrow leaving the United States, headed down to Jamaica. And we've also uncovered a great deal of US born enslaved individuals who were forced to migrate to Jamaica. And one of those advertisements is pictured here on screen in the red square. And so we hope to tell their stories in the same way that we're telling the stories of people coming from West Africa into Jamaica. We're currently testing it and it's going well so far. But what we really want to do is to tell a story, an Atlantic world story about Black craftspeople. And so, what we knew from the beginning was that some museums simply do not do this kind of research work to uncover the stories of the Black creators behind the objects in their collections that we all enjoy. Some museums significantly undercount Black craftspeople by not addressing the realities of Black life during this country's tumultuous history. And so this is that type of negligence drives the BCDA and pushes us forward. And in doing this work, we are guided by the 5 principles that you see here on screen. And so we're continuing to work on our understandings of digital archives and digital maps and continuing to expand our thoughts on the continuing presence of Black craftspeople in these spaces and on the landscape. Historian and scholar Omaka Ochekwu once said, quote, "Wherever Black people show up is the archive." And we're continuing to do our work in that vein and building upon the work of acknowledging Black craftspeople started by so many scholars before us. And what we've learned so far in this process is to just do it. Through the BCDA, we hope to center the action and presence of Black craftspeople and their experiences. We hope to continue to consider how places associated with Black craftspeople are created and how they sometimes disappear. And we hope to consider how objects associated with Black craftspeople are created and also disappear. What remains steadfast through our examination of the many states where we have ongoing research is that many of the physical spaces associated with Black craftspeople are gone, but the land is still there, and we can use that land to tell stories and bring about significant change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Oh my goodness, what an incredible project. Let me really quickly go to questions here. But actually, before I go to that, I did want to ask, as far as funding for this project goes, are there ways that people can donate, or are you fully funded through something else?
So the best way for people to donate to the project is by going to blackcraftspeople.org, and there you'll find a link that says make a donation, that directly connects you to our fundraising arm, which we run through my university, Sewanee, the University of the South. And we use all of that money to fund internships. We have a new internship program that's launching this fall that is being funded through donations of organizations and supporters of the project. And so it's for us, it's all about research, and it's all about really bringing students into this project. And because we're a project that is all about acknowledging labor, we like to pay everybody that we work with. So
Of course, yeah, that's very important. Well, great. Well, I hope some of our watchers today are able to go and help out. So let's see. We have a question here. Were many trades gender specific?
oh, absolutely. And so, where we find women the most is, of course, in anything that has to do with sewing. So, dressmakers, seamstresses, weavers, knitters, net makers for boats, all are trades that are occupied by women. But what we have found in doing this research are women brick makers working on brick plantations in South Carolina. And one of the things that we considered in telling these stories is that by originally beginning our source base with advertisements seeking the return of enslaved individuals, we know, and other scholars have often discussed, that enslaved men self emancipated at a far greater rate than enslaved women. So we recognize that there's going to be a discrepancy in how they appear in the archive, with that being our only source base. So one of the approaches that we began taking this summer is combing through private papers, because we know that women are there and we know that they are involved in everything. And so we've been lucky so far in that research and finding records on women, enslaved women listed in private papers. As you know, weavers, we've documented purchases made for some of these women. For example, we're working through the private papers, Pinckney Island, which is it was an island with 3 plantations on it in South Carolina. We have their account ledger, and one of the things that we've noticed is them buying spinning wheels, different types of fabric. So obviously there are women in these spaces who are creating things and making things.
Yeah. Let's see. Someone is saying, thank you for this excellent lecture. I am a potter who lives and works in St. Louis. I've been trying to find out if there were pottery businesses in St. Louis and or Missouri that employed free Black craftspeople, or who used enslaved labor to make pots similar to Dave Drake's experience. You mentioned a few craftspeople in the area, but I didn't know specifically if there were potters.
Take a guess and say that there probably were. I have not found any in the area yet, but I definitely wouldn't rule it out.
Okay.
And I think, when I think about potters, I'm thinking about the way people back then used pottery. So there may be food historians who have talked about that because of using the pots to store liquids and foods and meats and things like that. So that may be a good avenue of research to explore as well. But that's interesting. I'm going to look that up.
It seems like it's like a never-ending project, really. Let's see. Thank you, Dr. Momin, for a phenomenal talk and for continuing to find and share Missouri stories. While recognizing that you can't do everything all at once, how have you and your team prioritized what comes next in terms of research?
Sure. So we began by first in South Carolina, because that's where we sort of began testing the project first. That's where the bulk of my graduate school research was from. So that helped us. And then from there, I am a native Tennessean. So we moved to Tennessee because I wanted to explore in my own backyard. But then we began thinking about areas areas that were populated early in the South, right? So it was very natural for us then to go to Virginia, and then to go to North Carolina. And we've come across other researchers, particularly our Georgia researcher, Daniel Chamberlain, who we knew just through working in the decorative arts world, and who we asked if, would you like to begin Georgia for us? So that's how Georgia came on the map. We have students at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, who are working on North Carolina for us. So it's really been for us just the thing of figuring out who we knew, who was doing research in this on Black craftspeople in these areas, asking them if they wanted to partner with us, and taking it that way. And so what we have done is that researchers often multitask. For example, my colleague that I mentioned in the presentation, Victoria, handles Tennessee and Virginia. I'm in South Carolina and Jamaica. Dr. Torin Gadsden, who's co-director, is in North Carolina, and I believe he's begun venturing out into Delaware.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that because he's just starting, but we'll see how it goes. But we think about what we can handle, where we can find people to work with us, what universities we have relationships with that may have students that could work with us. And we just sort of handle it on a case by case basis.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like it's grown fairly quickly. I mean, you
Oh,
really
yeah.
just launched this last year. So that's a lot going on in that amount of time. Okay, let's see. Thank you for this terrific presentation and for the important work you are doing through the BCDA. I'm curious to hear your favorite anecdote or two of the impact of your research on individual craftspeople and artists working today, on publications, on museum exhibitions, etc. I would imagine you and the BCDA team are having an important impact on the dialogue on historic and contemporary Black craftspeople. So I guess, yeah, anecdotes.
Absolutely. It's when I was in graduate school, I really began working in historic preservation. And so from there, my concentration was looking at sites built by African American people. And I was just sort of amazed as a student, still in the process of learning about how much was out there that I could still find. And so some of my favorite stories from the BCDA are always those stories of sort of those lesser known makers, those people that really nobody knows about, that they've long passed away, history's forgotten about them, and they're, missing from the records, so to speak. And one of my favorite stories about working with museums to uncover this work is I have a colleague, Annabeth Hayes, who is decorative arts curator at the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. And we went to graduate school together, so she knew all about the BCDA. And then one day she sent me an email and she said, "Hey, we got some objects in on a blacksmith shop in East Tennessee." And I was like, "Oh, great." And I was like, where did these come from? And then she mentioned that, "Oh, we think that they have a connection to the Museum of Appalachia, which is in Norris, Tennessee." And I was like, "Really?" And I was like, "Oh," because I quickly stopped through there one day when they were it was some sort of like a flea market or antique show type of event with vendors, but I didn't really tour the museum. I just gone, looked at a few things, snapped a few photos, and hadn't thought about it in a long time. And Annabeth says, "Yeah, it's a blacksmith shop." And actually, she's like that. The objects, and she's like, the actual blacksmith shop is still at that Museum of Appalachia. And I was like, "Really?" And I go back. This was probably 3 years before we had this conversation, and I'm just going through old photos, and I had actually taken photos of that blacksmith shop. And I had just, it was just one of those things. I hadn't thought about that since that day that I was there. But I think about it in terms of the work we do with museums, because when we talk to each other and collaborate and partner with each other, we can begin to fully flesh out these stories. We combine what we know, and we're able to do things better. And so one of my favorite things that I tell people all the time that I like to do is to collaborate with museums, because in looking at different collections, at the BCDA, we haven't uncovered any new objects. There's been no stories of someone finding a random object in an old house or something like that. It's really been us working with museums to ask new questions of objects that they already have.
Good. Let me double check here to see if there's any more. I was actually kind of wondering as you were talking about that, have you come across any instances where just kind of looking in those census records or what have you of finding um, family members or ancestors who are actually, or family members who are currently living in that area still? Have you, maybe that's too far into the future.
I haven't found any that are still, not yet anyway, that I can think of that are um, that I've been able to connect to a person that's living today. But one of the things that I like about this project is exploring those linkages.
Hmm.
And so one of the best stories about that is I always tell the story. It's out of Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington, North Carolina. Bellamy Mansion is a plantation museum there. And they done the research there to uncover the Black craftspeople behind the construction of that mansion. And one of them was Henry Taylor, who was a well known house carpenter there in Wilmington, North Carolina. And Henry Taylor's son is Robert Taylor, who goes on to MIT and becomes the first Black graduate of the architecture school there. And then Robert Taylor goes on to work at Tuskegee University, which is an early HBCU founded by Booker T. Washington. And so Robert Taylor was leading the building construction and carpentering divisions of that university. And when I think about that, I'm thinking about how what Henry Taylor taught his son Robert is then taught to all of these students at this university. And then they all go out and teach at other schools, then teaching people what sort of trickled down here from Henry Taylor. And so that's a very interesting story to me because we've also sort of tracked where some of those graduates ended up. Some went into business for themselves, others went to work at other HBCUs. And it's just, to me, it's just that story of knowledge transmission.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That is a fascinating road to go down. Okay, I think that we've got a couple of folks are asking if there are obviously besides the digital archive website, are there other resources that you recommend if people are particularly interested in maybe learning more, or other ways that they could maybe help with the project?
Sure. So there's a syllabus out on our website. If you look under the About tab and you hit the drop down, you'll find a syllabus there of books and readings. I always tell people to engage with contemporary Black craftspeople and artisans. There's a new African American craft initiative coming out of the Smithsonian Center for Folklore that is gaining popularity. So I advise people to look that up because they have a directory of Black craftspeople. And I would say, yeah, I obviously like to read. So one of my favorite things to do is to always read books and look at citations in books. What are the sources? And then going back and exploring those sources. And that's the way I sort of trace it back and find even more information about this topic.
Yeah,
And one of the things that we also ask people to do is if you have Black craftspeople in your family, there's a contribute tab there in the digital archive where you can send us their story. And we've gotten a few so far. And when those areas go live, those stories will go live. So yeah, I love a good email when someone tells me that, my grandfather was a carpenter or something like that.
Yeah, well, great. Well, maybe you'll get a few from St. Louis, from the St. Louis area soon, hopefully. Well, thank you so much, Tiffany. This was wonderful, and I mean, so very important and something that I think our audiences are really excited to learn about. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us today, and thanks to everyone who joined us today to watch. If you'd like, I encourage you to register to join us on Wednesday, July 14th at noon to hear scholar Solange Ashby speak about Nubian priestesses, queens, and goddesses in connection with the exhibition Nubia, Treasures of Ancient Africa, which is currently on view at the museum. You can register for that program and a lot more at slam.org/events. And thank you all and have a wonderful day.